Hanoi was not what I expected. After Da Nang, I thought I was simply going to another city. But Hanoi felt different immediately. More crowded, more layered, more restless. A city where people eat on the sidewalks. Scooters push through every gap. Lights reflect off still water. And whole streets seem to compete for your attention. At first it felt chaotic, but the longer I walked, the more I realized this city had its own rhythm. And somewhere between the crowds, the lake, and the noise, Hanoi started showing me something else too. Not just how this city works, but how life in a second act works too. I am 55 and this channel is my second act strategy. Practical research through travel, people, and building new skills. Vietnam is the first experiment. Change the input, rebuild momentum, and let clarity catch up. The moment I landed in Hanoi, I could sense the difference. Not fully yet, but enough. Da Nang had given me space. Hanoi gave me compression. Da Nang gave me openness. Hanoi gave me density. Some cities introduce themselves gently. Hanoi does not really do that. It comes at you through atmosphere. The air feels different. The rhythm feels tighter. The city feels layered. And when I stepped out and started moving into the streets, that impression only got stronger. I said it simply, we are at Hanoi. But what I was really thinking was, this is going to be different. Once I got into the old quarter area, Hanoi started revealing itself almost immediately. The streets looked different from Da Nang and Hoi An. There were more people eating outside, more tables and chairs pushed onto the sidewalk, more people lingering together in groups. The streets did not feel like they were only for transportation. They felt like extensions of daily life. People were eating on them, talking on them, selling on them, watching on them. Scooters, cars, and pedestrians all moved through the same limited space. And somehow the city kept functioning. That was one of my first real observations about Hanoi. It did not feel designed for neatness. It felt designed by use, by habit, by need, by repetition, by a long-running agreement among people who somehow understand how to move through one another. And then, in the distance, I heard drums. Tet was not completely over. A dragon performance was still moving from street to street, sometimes entering shops, carrying that leftover festive energy that reminds you a new year has just begun. And people are still hoping it begins well. That was a nice surprise, because it gave my first impression of Hanoi an extra layer. This was not just a crowded city. It was a city still carrying celebration. One of the things I talk about in Across the Table, Across the World is the importance of reading the terrain before reacting to it. In negotiation, if you misread the terrain, you misread leverage. You misread incentives. You misread where people are coming from. The same thing applies when you enter a new city. If you judge too quickly, you miss the logic. And Hanoi definitely has a logic. At first, it can just look like disorder. Too many scooters, too many people, too much happening at once. But if you keep walking, you begin to realize there is structure inside the chaos. Not formal structure, not the kind marked neatly with signs and boundaries, but living structure. People know how to move. People know when to stop. People know how to claim a little bit of space and then give some back. And that to me is always interesting, because many things in life look chaotic before you understand the pattern beneath them. Then I noticed something that caught my attention for a totally different reason. A long line for roti. And I remember thinking, what is going on here? There were two bakeries right next to each other, and one had a much longer line than the other. The bread itself looked a bit like a coffee bun. Nothing about it, at least from first glance, seemed like it should produce that kind of demand. So I started wondering why. Was it really that much better? Had one place gotten more social media exposure? Did one video somewhere convince people that this was the one to try? That is one of the things cities like Hanoi remind me of. Human behavior is often driven as much by signal as by substance. When people see a line, they assume value. When they see demand, they become more curious. When enough people gather around something, the gathering itself becomes part of the attraction. I was tempted to get in line, but I decided to keep walking. Sometimes it is better to keep moving than to solve every curiosity right away. Still, it stuck in my mind, because in a small way, that line said a lot about modern life. Attention drives desire. Visibility creates demand. And once momentum starts, people do not always want the product alone. They want to be part of what other people have already validated. As I kept walking, I came across a large plaza, and the energy there felt different from the tighter streets. This was a place where people gathered more openly. Adults brought children. Kids played with toys. People lingered without looking rushed. I like spaces like that in cities because they tell you something important. They show you where the city breathes. Not every public place is built around commerce. Some are built around release. A place where families can come, where people can stand around without needing to buy something every minute, where a city can feel communal instead of transactional. And in a place as dense as Hanoi, that kind of open public energy matters. Then I reached Hoan Kiem Lake, and for me, this was one of the first moments when Hanoi showed me another side of itself. The water was still, the lights reflected clearly. The whole area felt brighter because of that mirrored glow. What I liked about the lake at night was not only the visual appeal, it was a shift in mood. People were still there, of course, walking, talking, sitting, observing, but the energy was calmer, more reflective. I could immediately see why this place draws people at night. There is something about water in a city that changes the tempo of human behavior. People slow down. They walk with less urgency. They rest a little more easily. Near the lake, Hanoi still felt alive, but it no longer felt like it was pressing against me. It felt like it was opening up, and that mattered. Because already I was beginning to feel that Hanoi contained two different experiences. One was movement, density, commerce, and noise. The other was pause, light, reflection, and room to think. That duality would stay with me throughout the trip. And maybe that is part of why I like travel more now than I did when I was younger. When you are younger, you often chase stimulation. When you are older, you still appreciate excitement, but you also notice what steadies you, what gives you a little peace, what helps you think. Hoan Kiem Lake had that effect on me. One of the things I often do in a new place is just walk in the direction the crowd seems to be moving. Not blindly, just openly. Because if you are new to a city, sometimes the best first strategy is not to master it. It is to let it introduce itself. And around the lake and the surrounding streets, that is what I did. I followed the flow. I watched vendors. I watched groups of people sitting and talking. I watched tourists stopping for pictures. I watched families with children. And the whole time, Hanoi kept reinforcing the same impression. This city has energy, real energy, not polished energy, not curated energy, dense, layered, human energy. Then, on the way back toward the hostel, I passed through one of the bar streets. And this was Hanoi turned all the way up. Tables and chairs pushed far out into the street. Music thumping from multiple places at once. Workers trying to pull people into their venues. Tourists and locals moving shoulder to shoulder. Getting from one end to the other took time because the street itself was part venue, part walkway, part spectacle. And what struck me was how many people had their phone cameras out while simply walking through it. That told me something important. For many people, walking through the street was not just a transition. It was the experience. The energy itself had become the attraction. Every bar was competing for attention, competing for sound, competing for mood, competing to be the place where a stranger decides to stop. And again, I could not help seeing this through the lens of strategy. In business, visibility matters, positioning matters, attention matters. The best offering in the world can still be overlooked if nobody notices it. And on this street, nobody wanted to be overlooked. That is why the sound was loud. That is why the staff were proactive. That is why the entire place felt like one long contest for attention. Eventually, I decided to walk into a bar just to see how lively it really was from the inside. Sometimes you have to step into the energy to understand it properly. The next day I went back out to the same area near the lake, and daylight changed everything. Hanoi at night had felt atmospheric. Reflections, lights, and crowds gave the city a kind of cinematic appeal. By day, things were clearer. The lake still had charm, but it felt more exposed, more honest. I noticed banners hanging near the walkway, likely still there because Tet had only recently passed. They gave the area a festive look, a little reminder that the city was still carrying the mood of the new year. And as I walked, I saw many young people sitting on benches or along the edge near the lake, just enjoying the peace that water seems to bring. That was another thing I appreciated. Even in a city that feels so active, people still seek quiet moments, still seek places to sit, to talk, to slow down. That never changes, no matter how busy a city becomes. Then I headed back toward the old quarter in daylight. And that was when I could see even more clearly what kind of city Hanoi is. Clothing stores, handbags, artworks, accessories, vendors, pedestrians, scooters, cars, even buses. Everything seemed to coexist on streets that, from an outsider's point of view, looked too narrow and too busy to function smoothly. And yet somehow they did. That is why I kept thinking of Hanoi as controlled chaos. It looked chaotic, but the people inside it did not seem confused. They knew where they were going. They knew what they needed to do. They knew how to move with the flow of the city, and that made me think about something deeper. In the second half of life, a lot of things can feel like chaos too. Career changes, identity shifts, questions about health, purpose, money, direction. From the outside, even your own life can look messy. But if you stay in it long enough and pay attention, you start to see the patterns. You start to understand what matters, what can be ignored, where to step, when to wait, how to move. That is one reason I wanted to make this video more than just a sightseeing record. Because cities sometimes reflect back to us the very things we are trying to understand about our own lives. And Hanoi, to me, was already doing that. As I walked back toward the hostel, I noticed another subtle thing. The bars were starting to get ready for the next night. Even before full evening had arrived, one person was already outside trying to pull people in. He recognized me from the night before and tried again. That made me laugh. Because once a city identifies you as a possible customer, it does not forget quickly. But as I kept moving, the noise slowly subsided. The hostel I was staying in, Old Quarter View Hanoi Hostel, was only around 100 meters away from the frenetic area. And yet getting there required walking through smaller alleys. And those alleys changed the atmosphere surprisingly fast. That contrast stayed with me too. You can be very close to chaos and still find a pocket of quiet. Sometimes peace is not far away. It is just not immediately visible. My first impressions of Hanoi were not neat. They were layered. This was a city of crowds, appetite, energy, noise, commerce, and movement. But it was also a city of rhythm, a city of patterns, a city that revealed more the longer I walked. What struck me most was that Hanoi did not ask to be admired from a distance. It asked to be entered, to be negotiated with, to be read, to be experienced block by block. And in that sense, Hanoi reminded me of something I believe more strongly now than ever. Whether in business, in negotiation, or in the second act of life, you cannot understand something meaningful by standing outside of it and reacting too quickly. You have to enter the terrain. You have to observe. You have to adjust. You have to keep moving long enough to see the pattern. That was my first lesson from Hanoi. Not just that it was chaotic, but that underneath the chaos there was structure. And underneath the noise there was a city very much alive.